Oh my God, it's the coolest thing ever. Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? Well, check this out. It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic famous foods from restaurants across the country anywhere nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. Seriously. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Dungeons and Dragons ride! Wow, neat!
Give me a break.
I don't like this!
Whoa! What's happening?
Whoa! Where are we?
You are at the Film Stories Podcast.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
The story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, it's given away by the title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, marketing stories, production stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. Each episode of Film Stories, well, each regular episode of Film Stories, I cover two films. And do you know what? I'm going to get on with the first of them. Here's a clip from the trailer from the first of those films. I'll come to the story of it the other side of this.
Here's the thing. We're a team of thieves. And when you do this, you're bound to make enemies. Sometimes those enemies come looking for revenge. Truth be told, we helped the wrong person steal the wrong thing. We didn't mean to unleash the greatest evil the world has ever known. But we're gonna fix it.
So how do we pull that off? Figure it out over a drink?
Probably best.
You need coolness!
To give us a fighting chance, we're gonna need strength. You got this, right?
I know you don't.
We also need courage, magic, and you.
Oh, thanks. That then was a clip from 2023's Dungeons & Dragons Honor Among Thieves. Directed by Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daly, the script is credited to them and to Michael Gilio, with story credit to Chris McKay and Michael Gilio, based on Dungeons & Dragons, credited to Hasbro, actually created by Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson all the way back in the first half of the 1970s. Cast for the film: Chris Pine, Michelle Rodriguez, Regé-Jean Page, Justice Smith, Sophia Lillis, and Hugh Grant. Now, the story of getting Dungeons & Dragons films to the screen, well, it's reasonably fraught. That there was a movie that came out. I mean, it was expected to be a bit of a franchise starter as well, all the way back in 2000. That film, coming back to it, was not a success. There's no real way to butter that up. And any plans for an extended movie franchise around it died out relatively quickly. And so, with the exception of a couple of straight-to-DVD sequels, coming to those in a second as well, the idea of a big screen new Dungeons & Dragons film based on the iconic role-playing game, well, it sat in limbo, eventually the rights reverting back to its creator. Now, it was then all quiet until suddenly it really wasn't. That out of the blue, in May 2013, came the news that Warner Brothers was in the Dungeons and Dragons business. It crowed that it had done a deal to secure the rights to make a new Dungeons and Dragons film. It was announced in the Hollywood trade press. And more than that, it wasn't just the announcement came in May 2013. The work had clearly been going on for a little while as well, because the Hollywood trade press reports that told us Warner Brothers had this film also informed us that a screenwriter by the name of David Leslie Johnson, who'd penned Wrath of the Titans for Warner Brothers and Red Riding Hood as well, well, he'd penned a screenplay called Chainmail. Now, Chainmail was related to a different game from one of the co-creators of Dungeons and Dragons, Gary Gygax, and the script for the script for Chainmail was now being shaped into a Dungeons and Dragons film. Now, this has sort of happened before in Hollywood history. That, I mean, you look at the Die Hard films and how scripts were meant for one thing and then turned into a Die Hard sequel, for instance. Roy Lee, who just enjoyed success with the Lego movie, he was going to produce this for Warner Brothers. And Courtney Solomon, who directed that ill-fated 2000 film, was also listed amongst the producers. It made sense, really, at this point in history, to have another look at Dungeons and Dragons, because even though the Lord of the Rings films had been and gone, The Hobbit was coming back to the big screen, and then on the smaller screen, Game of Thrones was going nuts. Fantasy was back in fashion and not the kinky stuff. So Warner Brothers was listing a Dungeons and Dragons film as a big priority, and by the middle of 2013, it was actively looking for a director for the script that it had that was getting close to ready to go. The problem was, within a matter of days, the metaphorical fit had hit the metaphorical sham. That Hasbro argued that actually it had the rights and was working on a Dungeons and Dragons film that it had set up at Universal Pictures. This again was being worked on without knowledge at this point until the news broke. And the news of these two projects broke within days of each other. It too had a writer. It had Chris Morgan, who'd been the key writer on the Fast and Furious films. And Morgan was going to direct the movie as well. And as a statement from Hasbro read, credited to a man called Wayne Charnas, the Hasbro spokesman, Hasbro owns the intellectual property rights to Dungeons and Dragons, because of Hasbro's acquisition of Wizards of the Coast in 1998. Now, Wizards of the Coast, the company who held the rights up to that point. Now, the 2000 film had still happened, but presumably the deal for the screen rights had been done before Hasbro came in and purchased Wizards of the Coast. You following this? Hope so. And so, the 2000 film as well, just to muddle this slightly, was released by New Line Cinema, which is in turn now owned by Warner Brothers. And you basically still had these two movies, the Universal film that Hasbro was backing and the Warner Brothers one that script was nearly done for. And so this looked like it was going to end in court, and it ended pretty much in court. That took time because it took over a year, really. That in 2014, in the autumn of 2014, the court case was being heard in Los Angeles. And after 7 days of it, both sides were still bullish about it, but the judge was just like, you need to go and sort this out. This is just getting silly. And an assortment of arguments were brought up during that court case. So there'd been a 2005 straight-to-DVD sequel called Wrath of the Dragon God, and a 2012 threequel, I use threequel, crikey, called The Book of Vile Darkness. Now, Hasbro, argued Warner Brothers, had disputed one of those films, but not the other. It argued that there was no consistency to its approach. Hasbro, meanwhile, said it owns Dungeons and Dragons. It should be able to make films based on its own property. And so after the court case was heard, it took another 10 months before it was resolved. And it was a case that the judge said, you need to sort this out. The ruling wasn't going to really help anyone at this point. It was just costing everyone money. And so in August of 2015, we've already lost 2 years of this story. Warner Brothers and Hasbro reached an out-of-court agreement that would allow the Warner Brothers project to go forward. Hasbro now listed amongst the producers of it. The Chris Morgan-based Dungeons and Dragons film, that was no more. Instead, the David Leslie Johnson script was back in play. No director listed at this point, but a very happy, upbeat statement was released to the trade press that cunningly overlooked the fact that both sides had been taking chunks out of each other for the last couple of years. Now, all they needed, now they had the agreement, was a film. And in March 2016, it looked very much like they had one. Now, Rob Letterman has made a mix of films. I don't particularly like his Gulliver's Travels one, but his Goosebumps movie of 2015 is great. A really, really good spooky family film and a box office success as well. And so Letterman was being sought to direct. He was apparently in talks to do so. This was still based on Johnson's script nearly 3 years after it first came to light. And there was some early casting talk that suggested big Dungeons and Dragons fan Vin Diesel was going to take a role in the eventual movie. He did not. But by May 2016, this was 3 years after the original announcements, Letterman was now officially announced as the director of a new Dungeons and Dragons movie for Warner Brothers. He had a vision for the franchise, which he presented to the studio. The studio liked it. Franchise was a key word here. They didn't just want one Dungeons and Dragons film. They were looking for lots of them. The deal was struck. Nothing really could go wrong, it seemed. And within a month, Ansel Elgort was being linked with a lead role in the film. And then things went wrong because for whatever reason, the movie just didn't get a green light. It sat there, it continued in limbo, continued in development, but there was no sign really, even though it apparently had a director and a script, of the movie actually happening. There was a moment too in April 2017. Lots of Dungeons and Dragons fans in the creative industries, one of whom, actor Joe Manganiello, who revealed in April 2017 he'd gone to Wizards of the Coast in 2016 to pitch a take on Dungeons and Dragons. In fact, he co-written the script, and do you know what? Dwayne Johnson was in the mix for it at that point as well. But as much as Game of Thrones had given fuel to the idea of doing a big fantasy movie, other things weren't working quite as well. The Warcraft movie, directed by Duncan Jones, much was expected of that, and it didn't really deliver at the box office. But that didn't stop the Dungeons and Dragons project altogether. But various parties just started to run out of patience. So it was towards the end of 2017 where Hasbro was a lot keener than Warner Brothers at that point on getting the film moving. And so Warner Brothers ducked out, and instead Hasbro partnered with Paramount Pictures, leaving some uncertainty as whether the Warner Brothers project at all was still live. But the confirmation was, it didn't take long to arrive, that Warner Brothers was no longer involved in the movie. So this was looking like it was back to square one. That script had gone, Rob Letterman had gone, the idea of Ansel Elgort starring appeared to have gone. But by the end of 2017, Hasbro's determination to get a film going not only had it that it was partnering with Paramount Pictures, but Paramount announced a release date of the movie. Now, it was still 3.5 years into the future, but Paramount said a Dungeons and Dragons film is going to be in cinemas on July the 23rd, 2021. A Dungeons and Dragons film was not in cinemas on July the 23rd, 2021, but the Paramount Hasbro project was moving forward, even if the Warner Brothers one wasn't. So it was director's time again. February 2018 we moved to. So this is only a month or two after the switch to Paramount. There was an acceleration here in development. And this is where we learned that Paramount was in talks with Chris McKay to direct. Now, by this point as well, Michael Giglio had penned a script for a new Dungeons and Dragons film. And McKay, off the back of the Lego Batman movie, was now in line to direct. Now, he had also been circling a project at Warner Brothers, a Batman spin-off called Nightwing, which to this point has not happened. I'm recording this towards the middle of 2024. But by early 2019, the screenplay that Michael Giglio had been writing was apparently ready. And in March of 2019, the Hollywood trades were reporting, well, actually now they're looking for people to star in the film. It had got that advanced. It was unclear if Chris McKay was still directing, given that he was juggling one or two big projects at that point and had a few choices. But the names that were being reported, some of which tittle-tattles, some of which substance, were Will Smith, Josh Brolin, Chris Pratt, Vin Diesel, Matthew McConaughey, Jamie Foxx, Joel Edgerton, Dave Bautista, Jeremy Renner, Johnny Depp. That was the kind of flavour of person who they were looking to bring into the Dungeons and Dragons film. Now, there was acknowledgement too that momentum had been lost when the Warcraft film had been released and hadn't done the box office. But separate to that, a pair of filmmakers, Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, had scored a hit with a delightful movie, a brilliant film called Game Night, which I've covered before on this podcast. If you've never seen Game Night, what a slice of fun that is. Interesting double bill at the moment as well with Alex Garland's Civil War for a reason or two as well. But Jonathan Goldstein and John Francis Daley, who'd been writing Spider-Man Homecoming at that point and were set to direct the new Flash movie for Warner Brothers. They didn't direct that for Warner Brothers. That film is coming up on a future podcast. Well, Francis Daley and Goldstein were now in pole position to direct the Dungeons and Dragons film instead. Now, at this stage in its history, Hasbro had a film arm to its business as well. It doesn't anymore. It's sold it off. But that film arm was Entertainment One, and Entertainment One was going to partner with Hasbro inevitably to get the film going. And so there was a sense that it was genuinely pushing forward, even more so when in early 2020 it seemed that a script had arrived that all concerned were happy with, to the level they needed to be happy. So the film was happening, obviously hampered by the small matter of a global pandemic, which put it back by the best part of a year. Still, in December 2020, as we were coming out of and going into assorted lockdowns, Chris Pine was pretty much confirmed as the lead in the Dungeons and Dragons film. And that was a turning point, really. That was the point where it finally felt real that this was going to happen. In fact, in January 2021, there was news then that a live-action TV show might be on the way in tandem with the film as well. That also never happened. But by February 2021, the rest of the cast was coming together off the back of Bridgerton. You have Regis Jean-Page, you have Michelle Rodriguez, Justice Smith. I mean, the core cast coming. Hugh Grant, one of the last to jump aboard. But in early April 2021, filming could finally begin on the brand new Dungeons and Dragons film. The initial shoot for it took place in Iceland, and then the production was primarily based in Northern Ireland for the bulk of filming. Ahead of shooting, there was some Dungeons and Dragons time as well, that as effectively they got the actors together to play a game of Dungeons and Dragons together so they could really understand the world that they were going into. As John Francis Daley noted in an interview he did with the Slash Film website, they were hampered to a degree by the quarantine rules that were in place for filming in the UK in early 2021. But they tried their best to turn that to their advantage. And so Daley said, thanks to quarantine in the UK, where everyone had to quarantine for 10 days, and it was very strict at that point because it was in the height of the pandemic, we had limited time to rehearse. That ideally they'd have spent a bit more time with the cast and got them rehearsing their sequences together. But what they did have, he said, what we wanted to take one of those days we had with our cast to do a campaign, a Dungeons and Dragons campaign, not just to familiarise them with the mechanics of it, but also because it felt like a really great exercise in expediting the chemistry between all of them. That because they couldn't do traditional rehearsals, they had to find fast-track ways to blend what is an ensemble cast together for a very much ensemble film. The whole tone of it was really important to Goldstein and Daley as well. As Daley would explain to IGN, he said, we wouldn't have done the film if they wanted it to be a cookie cutter, super serious, grim fantasy version that we've seen plenty of times before. Instead, he argued it was the tone that had been originated from the inception of Dungeons and Dragons that is so unique and is what hooked us into the prospect of doing this film. It's one of a kind and you're allowed to have fun, and that to me is what makes for a fun film in the first place. And so the film touch points that they were looking at were movies such as the Monty Python TV show and films. The Princess Bride came up a lot as well. And then, they explained too, we started with the idea of a heist film, a kind of Ocean's 11 thing, where you bring together a disparate group of people and a mission to accomplish. But he said also that felt very D&D-ish. But it also felt like a genre of movie that we knew how to get our heads around. And then we just built the characters around that. And that's basically the guts of how they started to put this together. They were very wary that the Dungeons and Dragons world allows you to bring in sizable amounts of magic that can basically unseat a story and make resolution a lot easier. And so they put in little buffers that wouldn't give them that kind of get out of jail card. Also, they were up against, during the shoot, a challenging budget that the film cost $150 million. That doesn't sound like a particularly challenging budget, but just a week or two ago on this very podcast, we were talking about Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, that cost over $400 million. And producer Jeremy Latcham, who'd come aboard the project, did concede to Screen Rant that the budget gave them some boundaries. He said there were some creatures that we wanted to put in the film that we ultimately ran out of money for, because they were what ended up being kind of expensive gags and also just kind of slowed down the pace of the movie. Goldstein too noted that the demands of a film are that you want it to be around 2 hours and have certain structural requirements. And contrasting it to the game, he said it's very different from a month or year-long game you do once a week. So it had to have a narrative drive that would propel you through and that required certain story beats and certain things to happen so that it didn't just feel episodic. You felt like you were really on a quest. This was, they'd set themselves all these rules in which, basically to set their world and to set their film. And they were looking at the tone of the 80s movies as well that they grew up with and loved, the Indiana Jones and things like that. They also wanted as much as possible to do practical work on set. This is coming up quite a lot on this podcast, actually, particularly with more and more recent films where there's a sense that audiences are so savvy to CG and so fussy about CG as well that going back to doing things practically is actually more effective. It's also, there's a kind of purist approach to it as well. So they were doing quite a lot of practical work on set, although obviously, the dragons weren't real. I hate to be the person to spoil that for you. And so there was CG that was going to come in after filming, but for the bulk of that shoot, what they were able to do was do a reasonable amount in camera across some very extensive sets. The filming had begun in April of 2021. And it wrapped up filming on August the 19th, 2021. That's after the release date that Paramount announced. You've probably picked up on. But the movie had to be delayed in line with pretty much every other movie that needed to be delayed as a result of the global pandemic. It had a release date initially delayed to November of 2021. Then it was pushed back to May of 2022. Then it was pushed back to March of 2023. It wasn't, in fact, until April of 2022 that we got the official title, Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. But then, by then, a little bit of post-production trickery and changing around had happened. This is the spoilery bit, I guess, if you've not seen the film. So jump forward about 2 minutes because it's just about someone who appears in the film. Because when they originally shot the film, they had this idea for one particular role to have a recognisable actor in a cameo. They're only in the film very, very, very briefly. But because, as Goldstein and Daly explained to Entertainment Weekly, because of the challenges of the pandemic and quarantine rules, they couldn't just bring anybody in. And so the one person they had close at hand who agreed to help them out was Dexter Fletcher, a writer, director, actor who's appeared on this podcast a couple of times. And so, as Goldstein says, anybody who was willing to come to work with us had to endure a quarantine in the UK, so it limited some of the choices we had. They had 1 day to shoot this particular scene, and as Goldstein said, Dexter was a friend of the court and someone who we thought would be great, and he was kind enough to come along and do the part. And thus, he came in and shot the particular moment that we see, and it was only deep into post-production that it was reshot with another actor instead, and Dexter Fletcher was replaced in the film. I'm not going to spoil who the other actor is because it's just a joyous moment in the film. But a Dungeons and Dragons film just attracts people, that much is clear, just for enthusiasm for the game. It attracted composer Lorne Bell, for instance, who an avid Dungeons and Dragons fan who really, really, really wanted to score the movie and indeed would go on to do so. There was the point then where, after many, many years of challenges and problems, this was finally going to happen. That it inevitably went to San Diego Comic-Con in July of 2022 to properly start teasing the movie, and that's when we got the first trailer. And the expectation and the excitement for the film, particularly amongst Dungeons and Dragons fans, was on the up. I think for those who weren't Dungeons and Dragons fans but film aware, the choice of filmmakers was promising. The cast looked promising. And so it looked like this was going to be a successful production. The test, as always, was putting it in front of an audience. And so perhaps wisely, what Hasbro Paramount decided to do was to give this an opening at the South by Southwest Festival in March of 2023 to debut the movie in front of a friendly crowd. The premiere, therefore, took place on March the 10th at the festival, and from reports, I wasn't in the room, again, playing to a very friendly crowd, it apparently blew the absolute roof off. Particularly, just comparing this to the 2000 film, it was chalk and cheese, a dramatic difference. And what Paramount was trying to do with this was, if you go back to J.J. Abrams' Star Trek reboot of 2009, the idea and the thinking behind that was extend this beyond the core audience and see what happens. And the early response, certainly from critics, was suggesting it had managed to do so, that this was a fun adventure and fantasy film that didn't rely on you having foreknowledge of the material of the game. In fact, it was also being released against a backdrop of a lot of very serious and dark films, and this really went for humour and accessibility, and it paid off. Personally, I had an absolute blast watching the film, and the general response to it was on the strong side. Would it, though, be able to find an audience beyond that core Dungeons and Dragons? Well, a bit mixed answer to that, really. That the movie opened in the US March the 31st to April the 2nd with an opening weekend of 37.2 million, which was not... I mean, ideally they would have wanted it to push above 50. John Wick Chapter 4 had opened the week before to a lot of money, and even dropping 60% on its second weekend, John Wick Chapter 4, which had a far more restrictive R rating, had grossed 28.3 million. Dungeons and Dragons 37. I mean, just wasn't shabby, but still, third place, His Only Son, 5 million. That was the other big opener, big-ish opener. Scream 6 was around after 4 weeks and was just about to creep over 100 million. Creed 3 in the midst. Shazam! Fury of the Gods, 1001, 65, Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, and in 10th place at the US box office that weekend, The Journey, a music special from Andrea Bocelli. I'm not covering that in a future episode of the podcast. Within 1 week, Dungeons and Dragons had been knocked heavily off the top of the chart and was down to 4th place. It had dropped 62%. Higher really than I would imagine executives have wanted. The Super Mario Brothers movie, the animated film, 146 million opening weekend. Dungeons and Dragons had no chance. John Wick Chapter 4 stayed in second place, 14.4 million. Ben Affleck's Air, 14.4 million, and Dungeons and Dragons was kind of struggling really to get a foothold. In fact, there's quite a lot of competition. There was Russell Crowe on his bike in The Pope's Exorcist the week after for 9 million. There was Nicolas Cage in Renfield as well, 8 million. And it didn't really take that long for Dungeons and Dragons to basically plateau at the US box office. Hung around in the top 10 for a little while, to be fair to it, but it wasn't a massively competitive top 10, and it was out of the chart. It was out of the top 10 at the US box office. I think it wasn't until the end of May, actually. So it hung around for about 2-3 months, and its US total gross, though, 93.2 million. Its overseas gross, 114 million. Total worldwide takings, 208 million, was probably just not enough to trigger the franchise and the sequel that people were looking for. Certainly the studios were looking for. But I mean, on the whole, I think they won more than they lost. I mean, Forgotten Realms creator Ed Greenwood, for instance, he wasn't involved in the film. He wasn't credited for any of the work that he'd done that come in. He came out and said it's a film that Dungeons and Dragons fans could be proud of. I mean, the endorsements were coming in. Hugh Grant as well. I mean, he'd been open about the fact about how he was scared stiff of the gamers, of the Dungeons and Dragons fan base, and the fear that they might be territorial. I don't really think that came across in the end. I think Dungeons and Dragons fans were slightly harsh. My former colleague Lauren Miles certainly was slightly harsher on it than I was. But still, this was a project that had gone through so many hurdles, had taken 10 years since that initial announcement. The resultant film, really, really good fun, perhaps just released at just the wrong time. Maybe, I don't know. I would say, if you've not had the pleasure, dig it out. Do it with a double bill with Game Night and you are in for a treat. And that all helpfully brings us to the halfway point of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'm just going to do a couple of parish notices before getting on with, the rest of the episode. First of all, if you like this podcast and don't mind supporting it, there are a bunch of ways you can do so outside of lending it your ears. I'm very grateful you've lent it your ears, so thank you so much for doing that in the first instance. If you want to support us financially, then if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put some coins in the pot there, then pretty much every week you're getting the podcast early, you're getting it ad-free as well, and you're also getting the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. Costing you absolutely nothing, meanwhile, is if you go to your podcast home of choice and subscribe to the podcast. That really helps with independent podcasts like this one. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, stuff like that is gold dust to podcasts like this. And it's pretty much the only reason I managed to get as far as we've managed to get. We also do print magazines with the Film Stories name on. I'm absolutely thrilled to announce issue 50 of Film Stories magazine, a print film magazine done entirely independently. It's 168 pages. It is the UK's biggest film magazine by a lot of pages, and our special birthday issue leads with a huge exclusive interview with William Shatner. William Shatner. You can find that for sale at store.filmstories.co.uk. While you're there, you'll also find the summer 2024 issue of Film Junior magazine, a print film magazine for youngsters. That's leading with a load of exclusive stuff with huge thanks to John Krasinski of the film If, as well as talking to the director of the new Garfield film, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff in there. You can find all of those at store.filmstories.co.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the fulfilling work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.uk.
Now, though, I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories, and it's an inclusion in the podcast that's really just down to listener demand. Every single week I get letter after letter after email, just asking, this podcast has been going for 6 years, nearly 6 years. When are we going to hear Gerard Butler sing? Folks, I've got your back. Here's a clip. I'm going to come to the story the other side of this.
Sing once again with me a strange duet. My power over you grows stronger yet. And though you turn from me to glance behind, the phantom of the opera is there inside your mind.
That then was a clip from the 2004 movie The Phantom of the Opera, directed by Joel Schumacher. Screenplay credited to Andrew Lloyd Webber and Joel Schumacher, based on the musical The Phantom of the Opera by Lloyd Webber, Charles Hart and Richard Stilgoe, and in turn based on The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux, starring Gerard Butler, Emmy Rossum, Patrick Wilson, Miranda Richardson, Minnie Driver, amongst a very, very extensive ensemble cast for the film. And I mean, it seemed pretty much a bit of a no-brainer, really, to make a film of the staggeringly successful musical The Phantom of the Opera. That it's based on Andrew Lloyd Webber's 1986 musical, which took Broadway and the West End by storm. And it always seemed a bit of a matter of when rather than if we would get a film of said musical, that it was going to clearly make its mega bucks on both sides of the Atlantic, but there'll come a point where, just cash in, get it onto the big screen. And there were offers, of course, over time, and Andrew Lloyd Webber too had had a musical head to the big screen before, Jesus Christ Superstar. Not that he was particularly pleased with it, but still there had been a path already established, and he had a way towards movies. That at the point our story kicks off, Evita had made it into cinemas a year or two before, starring Madonna, directed by Alan Parker. What united really Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita was Andrew Lloyd Webber was relatively hands-off with them, but he would be less hands-off with The Phantom of the Opera. Now, in fact, the film story of it does precede the Evita movie, although the Evita movie took a long, long time to get to the screen. So let's go all the way back to the back end of the 1980s, when Andrew Lloyd Webber had seen the film The Lost Boys, directed by Joel Schumacher, and was really hugely impressed by how Schumacher had used music in that film. There was no shortage of offers from established filmmakers, from studios, for the screen rights for The Phantom of the Opera, but it wasn't until 1988 that it was announced that Andrew Lloyd Webber had struck a deal with Warner Brothers to make the film. It had taken a little while, relatively quick still, but a little while, and part and parcel of that was that Andrew Lloyd Webber retained creative control. He had sign-off on director, on screen. I mean, basically, if there was anything about it he didn't like, then he had some degree of power of veto over it, and it certainly wasn't going to go ahead without a director he approved of. His choice was Joel Schumacher, and it's interesting where Schumacher was in his career at this point. He certainly had a couple of successful movies to his name, St Elmo's Fire in 1985, The Lost Boys in 1987. But he was still, Flatliners was still round the corner in 1990, and that run in the 1990s that saw him became Warner Brothers' go-to director for a whole lot of films, from Falling Down, The Client, Batman Forever, A Time to Kill, and of course Batman and Robin in 1997, when things started to go, let's just say, a little bit awry. But still, he was a surprise choice for Phantom of the Opera. He hadn't directed a musical. He just had a film that had used music well. Still, deals were being struck quickly. For Warner Brothers, if he could get the rights to Phantom of the Opera, it worked with Joel Schumacher before. Yeah, this could work. This could happen. And so it was all starting to come together very, very quickly. The idea was to shoot the film in London in 1990 at Pinewood Studios. The budget for it was going to be in excess of £10 million. Now, filmmaking in the UK towards the back end of the 1980s and the early 1990s, well, it was something of an endangered species. Certainly a film of this particular scale, that the British film industry was in the doldrums unless you were making period dramas. And in terms of big Hollywood productions coming to the UK, nothing like it is now. Very much, we'd gone into a fallow period where it was more the exception than a bit more of the norm. So it was a big deal that a Phantom of the Opera movie was going to be made at such scale in the UK, only it wasn't. Joel Schumacher, however, certainly didn't know that instantly at the time, and he would reflect to Entertainment Weekly many, many years later that Lloyd Webber saw The Lost Boys in 87 and wanted to meet me. He said, we were going to make the movie at that time with Michael Crawford and Sarah Brightman. Now, they were the stars of the West End version of the show, Andrew Lloyd Webber was married to Sarah Brightman at this point, though, and it was the end of that marriage that put pay, as the story goes, to this initial attempt to get the Phantom of the Opera onto the screen. So as Schumacher said, we were going to make it, but then Sarah and Andrew chose to separate amicably and everything got tied up in settlements. Then for Schumacher, he said, my career took off and I was really busy. And so one thing that had happened at that point, I mean, Schumacher he acknowledged he only had a handful of movies to his name when Lloyd Webber came calling in the first place. But they stayed in touch. Remarkably, they became friends over this prolonged period of time. So even though there was over a decade until the next attempt to get Phantom of the Opera to the screen in earnest, what they'd got from the back end of the 1980s was a screenplay that they'd put together and a friendship. And Schumacher, as such, consistently remained the top choice to direct the film. Now, musicals weren't particularly in vogue at the cinema in the late 80s and early 90s. The likes of Grease had come and gone many, many years before. What really got things going again was the huge success of Rob Marshall's film version of the hit musical Chicago at the start of the 2002 off the top of my head, which not only made an awful lot of money, but took Best Picture at the Academy Awards. And so we moved to 2002. I mean, this whole story's moved forward nearly, 13, 14 years at this stage. And Schumacher's career was very much in a different place. Previously, he was at the infancy of his career with just a handful of films to his name. Now he would come out the other end of a very, very tricky patch that he'd gone from after Batman and Robin. He had been originally set to make another John Grisham adaptation, the film with the runaway jury, but he stepped away from that to make the dark thriller 8mm with Nicolas Cage in 1999 and the drama Flawless with Philip Seymour Hoffman and Robert De Niro at that point. And the intent was clear. He was going lower budget. He was coming out of the studio glare a little bit. Notably, he was one of the people who discovered Colin Farrell in the 2000 film Tigerland, a very indie, gritty war film, really, that helped re-establish his critical faculties. 2002's Bad Company and 2002's Phone Booth also followed. Phone Booth, I've covered before, had been in development for a long time, but there was just a real sense that Schumacher was getting his confidence back, was getting his mojo back. And so it got to the point where he had, 17, 18 films to his name when Chicago hit big and the idea of doing Phantom of the Opera again came around. And as he told IGN, he was just ready to make it then. He was in a better place too. He got more experience. But also he made the point that they were a bit more distanced from the show. And he said, I think we were more removed from the success of the show than we would have been had we made it in 1990. 1990, of course, would have been, 4 years after the show had debuted. The soundtrack album was still selling great guns at that point, and it was the big hit musical, with the exception of Cats, really. I'll name check Cats a little bit later, I'm sure. And Schumacher noted that to have made a film so close to the initial debut of the musical, that would have been looming over us a lot more. Now, it was over Christmas 2002 that Schumacher decided this time round, I'm going to do it. And he and Andrew Lloyd Webber had been friends for over 15 years at this point. Lloyd Webber, as I said, he'd been hands off with the films of Jesus Christ Superstar and Evita. Now, though, he wanted to get a lot more involved with one of his most personal musicals, The Phantom of the Opera. He moved quickly to get the control back as well, that he struck a deal with Warner Brothers to get the rights back to the Phantom of the Opera that the studio still held at that point. I would imagine it was a relatively easy argument because Andrew Lloyd Webber, under the rights deal he had with Warner Brothers, had creative control. So there was a degree of stalemate here. He could have just blocked everything had he wanted to. I'm not suggesting for a minute that he chose to. But Warner Brothers, by the looks of it, just cut its losses and gave the rights back to Andrew Lloyd Webber. I'm sure a few packets of crisps and some cans of pop changed hands. And the news hit in January 2003 that Andrew Lloyd Webber's Really Useful Group had bought the rights back, and now he was looking to mount The Phantom of the Opera as an independent production. He didn't want to do this with the whims of movie studios. I mean, Chicago made musicals hot at that point, but should they suddenly go cold, he didn't want a film being put into turnaround just because a studio now felt its predictor software was saying that musicals were no longer a thing. Now, Warner Brothers still stayed involved, but it took, as part of the resultant deals that were struck, the US distribution for the film. And it was also, I mean, overseas was a patchwork of rights, but it was also something that Schumacher and Lloyd Webber acknowledged early on, that what they had to do once they were definitely embarking on this was to restructure things a little. That the way, I don't want to spoil the musical if you've not seen it, I don't want to spoil the film if you've not seen it, short of to say that Gerard Butler sings in it. Have I mentioned that? But there is a chandelier moment in the midst of it, and where it sits in the stage show, Schumacher just didn't think that was going to work in the narrative flow of a feature film. And so what Lloyd Webber agreed to do was rework the structure of the show. And as Joel Schumacher explained as well, there were more overhauls. He told IGN, he said, "I thought it was very important to tell the Phantom's backstory and everybody's backstory, how they got there, and what Miranda Richardson's character," Miranda Richardson was cast, "relationship is with the Phantom." And Schumacher said all of those questions that don't seem to pop up in the musical, but for movie audiences, I think it's important to know a lot of the history of these characters and how they got there. Now, there's obviously a debate on that. Do we need to know how John McClane became a cop, for instance? How deep do you need to go into the characters? But Schumacher just opted that was the way he wanted to go with the film. It was still going to be a surprisingly light running time for a musical, over 2 hours, but we weren't clocking towards 3. And there were names being linked with it for all the time the Phantom of the Opera was in development, and it was certainly talked about even in that decade, 13-year gap where it just seemed to be in limbo. Well, Antonio Banderas became the presumed leading candidate for the film. That he was, he said basically to have been preparing for it at one stage, even though that wouldn't come to pass. Hugh Jackman would reveal in an interview around April of 2003, I think, that he took a phone call. His agency took a phone call to see whether he would be available to do the film, but he was in the midst of doing a bunch of movies. Swordfish was in there, Van Helsing was in there, and so, as he would say in this interview, I wasn't available, unfortunately, so that was a bummer. Emmy Rossum then would land the crucial role in the film of Christine, the female lead in the movie. And she was very, very young at this point. She was 17, I think, 16, 17 when she took on the role. It was, in terms of her filmography as well, it wasn't her first movie. She'd notched up credits notably in the Clint Eastwood Oscar-winning film Mystic River. She'd just been appearing with Roland Emmerich in The Day After Tomorrow. And she got several film credits to her name at that point, as well as a number of television appearances in shows such as Law and Order and Genius and The Practice. So she had acting experience, even though she was quite young, and she would ultimately audition and land this crucial co-lead role in the film. She was not the only candidate, though. I'll come to that shortly. For the lead role of the Phantom, well, it wasn't going to be Antonio Banderas, and this unlikely actor had bubbled to the top. Now, I won't hear a word said against Gerard Butler. I thoroughly enjoyed playing. I will happily talk about that film for many, many, many hours. But it still remains a surprise to some that arguably his big movie breakthrough was in a musical. Probably a surprise to Gerard Butler as well, because he wasn't really a singer. That he certainly took some lessons and prepared ahead of his audition in front of Andrew Lloyd Webber when he would sing the song Music of the Night. But as he would tell Entertainment Weekly in 2004, "I'm not a singer." He said, "I sang in a band when I was a lawyer, but most of it was screaming and shouting." Now, Butler had notched up some screen roles at this point. He wasn't green. He turned up in the film Timeline. He was appearing in an an acclaimed indie film called Dear Frankie, and his highest profile role was a support role in Tomb Raider: The Cradle of Life, directed by Jan de Bont. And as Gerard Butler explained to the BBC around the time of the Phantom of the Opera film release, when Joel called my agent and asked if I could sing, even he wasn't sure about it. He knew that I could sing, but not if I could handle something like this. And Butler admitted, "I was dubious myself as to why they were considering me for the Phantom until I read the script, and then I could completely understand why he came to me and why I would want to play it." Thus, in his mid-30s, after embarking on an early career as a lawyer as well, Gerard Butler found himself cast into the lead role of the big screen adaptation of The Phantom of the Opera. He was cast in the lead role 2 months before it was announced as well, but this gave him time to undertake a very long programme of singing lessons that would start in January of 2003 and go right the way through, even a month into the shoot of the film. Meanwhile, there was the casting of his co-star, that Katie Holmes was linked for a while, and then Anne Hathaway was said to have been offered the role, but she, the way the schedule stacked up meant she had an existing commitment to the film The Princess Diaries too, and so couldn't take on the role in The Phantom of the Opera. That thus, as previously just mentioned, went to Emmy Rossum, and she would, quite a coup for her, but as Schumacher said, finding her was something of a miracle. He explained to the New York Times, she came in at the 11th hour. She was 16 years old. She trained at the Metropolitan Opera when she was 7, and she was one of the key pieces of the casting jigsaw. You did have an age disparity between the romantic couple at the start of the film, nearly 20 years apart. This would be something that some would suggest would come back to bite the film a little. I will explore it just briefly in a little bit. But June 2003, the casting was locked for The Phantom of the Opera. Warner Brothers put up $8 million straight away for the US distribution of the film. The budget was going to be 70 to 80 million, and it was Lloyd Webber's company that was independently funding it, but also selling the film rights around the world. And as per a report at Playbill on the 15th of September 2003, Pinewood Studios played home to the first shots of The Phantom of the Opera. After all that time, 15 odd years in development, it was finally happening, based on a script by Lloyd Webber and Schumacher, and I didn't get any reference of any other screenwriters coming in. It would take over a fair amount of Pinewood as well. Shooting a film of this scale in the UK in 2003 was very different to how it would have been 15 years previous, that the UK was housing more and more bigger productions at this point. This one would shoot across 8 of the stages at Pinewood. A lot of practical stuff, not unlike Dungeons and Dragons. There was CG stuff in there, not least to put the top of the theatre in, but a drive to do as much in camera as they could. One person who wasn't shooting their work on the 15th of September 2003 was Gerard Butler. It was said it would be 4 to 5 weeks actually before he came in to do his first filming for the movie, and that gave him a bit of extra time just to get a few more of those lessons in. One person who was present on set throughout the shooting was indeed Andrew Lloyd Webber, and Schumacher would talk of the collaboration between the two, saying that he really, I think, fell in love with the music all over again and reinvented it, that Lloyd Webber was putting another 10-15 minutes of extra material into the musical. And Schumacher said, I focused on telling the story using the lyrics of the songs to act and not just do a performance, while he did all new orchestrations, and he worked very closely with the cast, especially with Emmy and Patrick and Jerry on the delivery of the scenes, Jerry being Gerard Butler. Butler would have to go through, 3 to 4 hours of makeup work to prepare for The Phantom. And the days, by the sounds of it, were relatively long. Everybody but Minnie Driver was singing their roles in the film. And the shoot went on for, 3-4 months. It wrapped up in January 2004, heading towards post-production. And all eyes, really, on a big release at Christmas of 2004. That the release date was being earmarked for December the 10th in the UK. That's where we were going to see it first. The build up to it, well, the expectation was this is one of the big films of the year, that this is going to be quite something. That a whole bunch of acclaimed film production people have been involved in the making of the film. I mean, it was a really high profile independent film when you think about it as well. And it was just a case of, could Joel Schumacher pull this off? Could they repeat the trick of Evita to a degree, but especially Chicago? That was really seen as the North Star of it. And the thing was, it didn't. really, that the critical response to the film was well, it was more on the sour side than anything else. That the film was 145 minutes, and no shortage of spectacle, but the restructure had a couple of ramifications. I mean, for one, those who were particularly fans of the musical, the core audience you'd suggest for the film, well, the musical had been messed around with quite a lot, really. That creative choices that had been made were not to the liking of everyone, not least people who turned out to be involved in the movie as well. The reviews, though, I mean, it was still possible to overcome them, of course. The reviews were not enthusiastic, and that instantly had an impact, really, on the expectation of an Oscar run. I mean, I will jump ahead. There were 3 Oscar nominations for Phantom of the Opera, but nowhere near Best Picture. It was up for Best Art Direction, Best Cinematography, and Best Original Song at the 77th Academy Awards. And, I mean, it lost every category. It was a competitive year. In fairness, well, I suppose they're all competitive years. But the best song one was the surprise. It went in the end to Al Otro Lado del Rio from The Motorcycle Diaries. It had been expected that Phantom would win. $1 Million Baby was the big winner of Best Picture at that particular Oscars. The Aviator took cinematography and art direction, and Phantom of the Opera went home empty-handed. It didn't go home with an enormous amount of money at the box office either, and perhaps that was a little bit more of a surprise, that this looked, I mean, it just looked like it had surefire hit written all over it. And to be fair, I mean, it's a profitable movie, made independently for 70-80 million. The overall receipts for it would be roughly double that around the world, but this wasn't Chicago numbers. And I mean, it opened over Christmas in the US, for instance, on a 622 screens. A limited screen release, opened with a decent screen average in 10th place, a $4 million opening weekend over that Christmas weekend, as Meet the Fockers took home $46 million in first place. The other films around that were in the Oscar ring, I mean, The Aviator was on its second week and was doing better. Spanglish is not talked about an awful lot. I always thought that was a pretty good movie. That had Oscar possibility to it as well. But as the Phantom of the Opera screen count was supposed to go up, well, the interest wasn't really spiking. That it stayed on the same amount of screens the following week. The numbers went up slightly, but it was up to 16 million at the US box office after 2 weeks. The test would be what happens when you add more screens. Well, Warner Brothers was quite restrained about that. It took about 3-4 weeks before it did. And by that point, other films were coming in and taking the money. Films such as Coach Carter, In Good Company, really underrated movie, In Good Company, Racing Stripes. Elektra had come in and made a few quid as well. And there was almost like a shyness to the way the Phantom of the Opera was rolled out. It was rolled out like an awards film in the US, and the anticipation was that's what it would be. But the name recognition of it was strong against other films that were about. You know, White Noise was about, Racing Stripes was about. And these were not known quantities. Phantom of the Opera was. And, I mean, once the Oscar nominations came out, its box office race was pretty much run. It topped out in the US at $51 million, $103 million outside of the US for 154 all in. Not a shabby result, to be clear, not a shabby result. But let's stack it next to Chicago, which took 170 million in the US, 136 outside the US, did double the Phantom money at 306 million, and took a boatload of Oscars home as well. Of course, the aftermath of this, there were all sorts of conversations about what went right and what went wrong. And, you know, we lost Joel Schumacher a few years ago. He left a really enjoyable collection of films and was always a good interview in his stuff as well. Andrew Lloyd Webber would reflect to Variety in 2004, though, that the casting of Phantom of the Opera was one that Schumacher called wrong in pushing for Gerard Butler for the lead role. And he said the Phantom was in the Phantom of the Opera, the Phantom was too young, and the whole point of the Phantom is he needs to be quite a bit older than Christine, older than Butler was, as it turns out. And so that age gap that I mentioned before, in Lloyd Webber's eyes, just wasn't really enough. There have been more Lloyd Webber musicals that have gone through development since. There's consistently talk of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, that coming to the screen. The most infamous was 2019's Cats, of course, which, again, Lloyd Webber has not been particularly praising of that in hindsight. In fact, as he infamously said, he saw cats and he bought a dog. What's surprising about Phantom of the Opera, really, is just how forgotten it is. I mean, at the point I'm recording this in 2024, there's no sign of a new physical media release or anything like that. Most of the stuff that's out there is pretty shabby. And yet, you've got this film where the guy from Olympus Has Fallen and playing, and Gerard Butler, I maintain, is a really good. I mean, dig out The Vanishing, the Gerard Butler headline version of The Vanishing. In fact, dig out the Dutch original version of The Vanishing, which is unrelated as well. But you see how good an actor he can be, and so the leap of faith to him singing, it's a leap, but perhaps not the leap you might be expecting. What's interesting, though, is that this film, that they came up with a way to do it at the end of the 1980s. They pretty much stuck to their guns, from what I can work out, right the way through. And what they ended up with was something that was sort of pleasing neither cinema goers nor fans of the show. And when it came to it, the absolute bottom line didn't really please Oscar voters and wasn't really getting punters out of their houses either. And that brings to the end this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find more from the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories on both of those platforms. If you go to Facebook, we're at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. If you go to YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories. I'm aiming to film a couple more of those this week. I bought some lights and everything. It's going to be amazing. Nothing could go right. Wrong. Nothing could go wrong. You can find our shop, as I've mentioned before, at store.filmstories.co.uk, and our website, filmstories.co.uk, is a clickbait-free entertainment website. Imagine how difficult that is to do and still get noticed. It's thanks to people like you clicking on it that we can continue to be a clickbait-free entertainment website. We do movies, we do TV, we do bits of games as well. Thank you so much for everyone who's clicked and supported. I think you'll agree, I've completely overstayed my welcome. All it remains for me to say now is thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care. Bye-bye, and go and listen to some Gerard singing.